Good evening, or perhaps not so good, depending entirely on your current tolerance for human secretions, non-existent baths, and a variety of social practices that would make any modern therapist abandon the profession immediately. Today, we are going to lay our heads on the pillow and drift gently back into the Middle Ages. Yes, that era filled with knights, castles, and, spoiler alert, a lot, and I mean a lot of mucus, where the glamour of fantasy series dissolves the second you discover what people did with their own waste, and worse, what they did with everyone else's. But before you surrender to the comfort of your bed, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There is always a new story, equally devoid of excitement, waiting to guide you into another night of deep rest. And tell me in the comments where you are right now and at what hour sleep decided to run away from you. It is always good to know there are others staying up through the night with me. Now turn off the lights. Let's embark together on this nocturnal journey, a journey of smells, textures, and traditions you will soon wish you had never known. We begin with one of the pillars of medieval society, social coexistence, or rather, the complete absence of any concept of hygiene within it. Yes, in the Middle Ages, going to the market could mean returning home with fish, bread, and cholera, a complete experience. As a bonus, the city streets were full of life and feces, because yes, everything was thrown out the window, literally, accompanied by a polite shout of warning, "Garde à l'eau," which translates to, "Watch out for the water." Except it wasn't water. It was urine, excrement, and the entire contents of family chamber pots flying straight onto the cobblestones. With luck, not onto your head. And shoes. They weren't invented to protect your feet. They were made to protect the waste on the street from touching you. Just one more layer of filth between your soul and the world. The alleys were canals of rot, veritable open-air buffets for rats, cockroaches, and diseases. And believe me, no one thought it was strange. It was just Tuesday. Eating on the street was also a common practice and a dangerous one, because hand-washing simply did not exist. You would just wipe your fingers on your tunic, on your leg, or on the hair of the nearest child. Cutlery was reserved only for very noble households. The common people used their hands, sometimes sharing chewed pieces as a demonstration of affection. Seriously, it was like the sharing stories of the era, and hearing someone sneeze was practically a request to move to a different city because no one knew what a virus was. But they knew that after a sneeze usually came fever, vomiting, and a long season on the village floor. But relax, this is just the beginning, because if you thought the streets were disgusting, just wait until you hear what happened inside the houses. And yes, let's enter slowly with our noses plugged and almost zero hope of leaving clean. You cross the threshold of a typical medieval house, small, dark, and smelling of thyme, goat, sweat, and sour soup, all at the same time, a true air freshener of the Middle Ages. Right away, you trip over something soft. It was supposed to be straw, but it has turned into a colony of mites and fleas with local citizenship. The house is a single room. Living room, kitchen, bedroom, and bathroom in the same space. Lie, there is no bathroom. The concept of a bathroom hasn't been invented yet. Everything is resolved in the bucket. Yes, that one in the corner, and no, it hasn't been emptied since yesterday, maybe since the day before. The bed is a wooden plank covered by straw, and if you're lucky, by a quilt that has seen 7 winters and 3 plagues. If you think your spring mattress is old, try sleeping on a surface that creaks more than a stranded ship. On the ceiling, smoke, because the fire is always lit, even without a chimney. The smoke stays there, accumulating in the upper part, helping to smoke not only the food, but the lungs of the entire family, children included. And speaking of children, there are 4, all barefoot, with hair hard from sebum and a look of someone who has seen more fungus than dolls. They share space with parents, grandparents, and sometimes a cow. Yes, animals inside the house, because it's safer. What if a thief decides to steal the family chicken? Better to keep the poultry inside, right next to the cradle. Actually, not a cradle. A box with rags and a rat sleeping in the corner, but nobody cares. He is the house rat. He even has a name. The kitchen, if we can call it that, is just a cauldron hanging over the fire. Inside it, an eternal soup. Truly eternal. It receives new pieces every day. A turnip here, an onion there, a bone found by chance. The soup never ends, it only transforms. A cycle of life and death in liquid form. And the utensils? Wooden bowls, spoons that look like fracture splints, and sometimes a knife that also serves to cut bread, meat, hair, and toenails. Multi-purpose. And of course, the lice. They aren't visitors, they are residents. You can even name a few. They are already part of the family, inherited from generation to generation. Hygiene here is a philosophical question. No one bathes because 1. The water is cold. 2. The river is far. 3. It is believed that opening the pores with water might let diseases enter, so better not to risk it. Result, a body odor that could be used as a weapon in battles. A bouquet of onions, smoke, critter, and pure olfactory persistence. And if you think that's bad, just wait for dinner, because the bread is hard, the soup is alive, and the wine is sour. But everyone eats, because everyone is hungry, including the rat in the cradle. And afterwards, it's time to sleep, all together. Squeezed tight, sweating, coughing, sharing blankets, fungi, and dreams, if one can still dream after so much reality. You close your eyes, but the smell won't let you. The creaking of the bed won't let you. The grandfather's cough won't let you. The chicken pecking at your foot won't let you either. Welcome to medieval intimacy. You didn't want to know, but now you do. Forget the abundant tables of the movies. Forget golden turkeys, exotic fruits, and full chalices. Real medieval life was an involuntary fast, with occasional pauses to chew old bread. Breakfast, if it existed as a concept, would be a bite of something hard. Usually bread, but not the fluffy bread from the bakery. It was more of a concrete disc tasting of barley and dust. You broke a tooth per bite. It was tradition. What did you eat this bread with? Nothing. It was the event, the star of the show. If you had a piece of onion or a bit of pork fat, it was already considered a banquet. It even received a blessing. And the water. The water was always a liquid Russian roulette. Clean, almost never. Tasty, only if you like earthy notes with a hint of dead rat. So many opted for weak beer. Yes, from breakfast onwards, because at least the beer was boiled, and that killed part of the microorganisms. The other part settled in your intestines. At lunch, nothing changed much. The so-called eternal soup was still there, bubbling and increasingly mysterious. What was inside? Better not to ask. It was the famous flavor of the day. Sometimes it was turnip. Sometimes it was something no one knew where it came from, nor where it was going. Meat only on holy days, and even then, barely. And it wasn't steak. It was bone with expectation. A rib of something that was once a quadruped, probably run over by a cart. The rich, of course, ate better, but this script isn't about them. It's about you trying to sleep with hunger and the smell of tallow in the air. Dessert? None. Just the aftertaste of expired yeast and the memory that your last apple had a worm that you ate along with it for protein. And hygiene during meals? Non-existent. Hands went from the bed straw straight to the bread, then to the nose and then to the plate. A culinary cycle that would leave any contemporary chef in a fetal position. Dinner was a rerun of lunch. Maybe the soup had thickened a bit. Maybe someone had thrown in more water to make it stretch. But the flavor remained the same. Resignation. And if you felt sick, well, bad luck, because the idea that eating could cause problems was a novelty. If you vomited, you vomited. You cleaned it with straw and went on with life or the fever. Eating wasn't pleasure, it was survival. Eating was swallowing the minimum to keep your legs working, and even that sometimes failed. So the next time you complain about the delivery that's late, remember, there were people who walked 8 kilometers to drink turnip soup with bacon scraps, and thanked the heavens with tears in their eyes. But now you can relax. Your dinner was hot, came on a clean plate, and no one spat in it beforehand. At least you hope not. In the Middle Ages, the human body was considered sacred until it started to stink. Then it was ignored. Bathing only if really necessary, which means never. The dominant theory of the time said that hot water opened the pores, and that open pores left the soul vulnerable to demons, diseases, and even gossip. Yes, everything could enter through the pore, including a malicious cold. So the bath became public enemy number one. People, in general, did not bathe frequently. Some, once a year, others, only when they fell into the river by accident. There were people who believed that bathing a newborn was dangerous. They preferred to wrap the baby in cloth and let it ripen. And there you are, fighting with the shower temperature. Of course, there were public baths in some cities, a kind of medieval spa, but these places quickly became synonymous with orgies, depravity, and skin diseases. And when the plague arrived, public baths lost what little prestige they had. They were closed. After all, if everyone is dying, the fault must be the water, not the rat. Clothes were not washed frequently, much less changed. One wore the same tunic for days or weeks, or until it tore, and even torn, it stayed on the body. Because patching was easier than facing the freezing wind with a naked body. Underwear, when it existed, was made of coarse linen and also rarely saw soap. That is, when there was soap. Often stains were merely incorporated into the fabric. The stain became a memory. This one here was the day the cow kicked me. This other one was the day the broth exploded. And hair, well, it depended on the class. Nobles used caps, hats, and wigs to hide ancestral greasiness. Peasants used what they had: wind, mud, and good luck. A comb only if it was made of bone, literally. And even then, it was more useful for hunting lice than for styling bangs. Teeth, a chapter apart. The idea of brushing teeth did not exist. There were those who chewed twigs, those who rubbed ashes, but generally oral health was a minefield. Black teeth, loose, falling out, aching, stinking. Halitosis was a personality trait. There were those who used herbs in their mouths, but it was more to disguise the breath than to clean anything, and the medicine of the time helped little. For any hygiene or health problem, the answer was bloodletting. That's right, draining blood. Because blood carried the bad humors, literally. The logic was, you stink, must be too much accumulated blood. It was common to leave the house dirty, return dirtier, sleep dirty, and repeat. The bed, by the way, was the epicenter of everything. A place of rest, meals, birth, sex, death. Everything happened there, and almost never were there sheets. And if there were, they were washed. Well, you already know, never. The lice were omnipresent. They lived on the scalp, in the seams of clothes, in the mattress, in the straw pillow. They were part of the bodily decoration. People scratched themselves in public without shame. After all, if you weren't scratching, it was because you were dead. There was even a utensil for this, a kind of long tweezer to crush lice. Some carried it hanging from their waists, like a talisman against discomfort. And if you thought that was bad, we haven't even talked about the wounds. Infected skin was common. Cuts, blisters, fungal infections, sores, everything living in harmony with the dirt. Constant itching was part of the routine. If you didn't scratch today, something is wrong. Nails grew free and were often used as tools. The long nail of the little finger could serve to scratch, scrape, crack nuts, and also carried a bonus ecosystem of bacteria underneath. And menstruation. Well, medieval women didn't have pads. They used reusable cloths. Some just hid at home for days. Others improvised with moss, straw, or even rags. There was no scientific explanation, only fear and taboos. A menstruating woman was considered impure. Some were isolated, others just ignored. And of course, no one washed their hands, because washing hands implied having clean water, time, and motivation, and no one had any of the three. The consequences? Well, diseases, infections, epidemics, early death, but who cared? On average, people died young. So between working, scratching, coughing and dying, there wasn't much room for soap. Now, lying in your bed, with clean sheets, dry hair and fluoride toothpaste, take a deep breath. You won the historical hygiene lottery, and yet you still complain about the line for the bathroom. You think romance in the Middle Ages was like in the movies, glances exchanged by candlelight, poetic declarations of love and secret meetings. Better prepare your pillow, because back then everything was more functional and far less glamorous. To start, there was the smell, literally. The first impression was always nasal. If the person didn't knock you out with their breath or body aroma, it was practically a compliment. Perfume, only if you were noble. And even then, it was more to hide the smell of horse than to seduce anyone. The essences included flowers, fat, and spices. An aromatic cocktail that left a question in the air. Is this seduction or a barbecue? Clothes covered everything except the dirt, but that didn't stop marriages, which happened more for convenience than love. In fact, love was a luxury. What really counted was the dowry. If she had land, it was passion at first deed. And regarding age, well, ethics wasn't a widely practiced concept. It was common for girls to marry at 12 or 13 years old. Much older men with possessions had the preference, all legalized by the law of the time. Of course, today it would be the nightmare of any human rights defender, and it wasn't rare for the marriage to happen without much consultation. You're going to marry so-and-so, and that's it. Consent was a detail, not a requirement. Privacy was also a legend. Often the couple shared the room with the mother-in-law, the children, and maybe a goat. The bed was communal, intimacy was improvised, and sometimes done standing up, not by stylistic choice, but because the floor was damp and the bed was occupied. Family planning? A joke. Birth control was non-existent. And even with all the risks, some women resorted to herbal infusions and superstitions to avoid more children, not out of rebellion, but out of pure survival instinct. And if someone committed adultery, it depended on who it was. Women were punished severely. Men, well, sometimes they even got a toast from society. Medieval justice, fair for those with a sword. The so-called women of the night had their place in the cities. They worked in designated zones, often with more access to hygiene than the nobles. Yes, because no one wanted to die before paying, but respect? None. They were marginalized, used and forgotten, and pleasure was ignored. The main function was to procreate. Feeling something was secondary. If it happened, it was by accident. Among the peasants, romance was what was left after the shift in the fields, a mixture of habit, necessity, and, with luck, some sympathy. Diseases linked to intimacy were frequent, and without antibiotics, without diagnosis, what is resolved today with a prescription was a sentence back then. Syphilis made constant visits, and no one knew exactly how to avoid it. They only knew that when it appeared, it wouldn't leave. The church did what it could to regulate everything. It created a veritable calendar of abstinence. Sex was only permitted on non-holy days, which, let's face it, was almost never, because every day belonged to some saint. Even so, desire ignored the sermons, because it's hard to follow rules when you are living with 7 relatives in a mudroom, and the only entertainment is trying not to die of cold. And love sometimes appeared disguised, whispered, sweaty. 2 hands touching by accident, 2 bodies trying not to freeze at night, 2 glances insisting on existing even in the mud. It was rare, it was brief, but when it emerged, it was almost magical, like finding fresh bread on market day. So the next time you complain about a bad date, remember, at least you don't have to share the bed with 3 children, your mother-in-law and a turkey. And if romance still seems complicated, at least today soap exists, waking up with the rooster's crow. Beautiful in poetry, but in real medieval life, you woke up with back pain, cold in your bones, and the certainty that the day would be exactly the same as the one before, and the one before that, and the one before that. Because working wasn't a choice, it was what stopped you from starving, being beaten by a guard, or expelled from the village for laziness. The concept of well-deserved rest was reserved for the dead, and even then, depending on the cemetery. If you were a peasant, spoiler, that was your function. Your job was basically to survive your own job. You ploughed the earth with instruments that would make a modern tractor laugh, and pulled the plough with the help of oxen. When you had oxen, when you didn't, you were the ox. The earth was hard, the tools worn, the sun merciless, the rain treacherous, the body tired. But the obligation didn't change. Plant, harvest, carry, feed the others, especially those who never laid a hand on a hoe. The feudal lord kept the greater part of what you produced. It was the rule. You planted 10, kept 2, sometimes 1, sometimes 0, because there was a plague or a storm, or just because the Lord was in a bad mood. Complain? Never. Because punishment came fast, beating, whipping, prison, or, in more serious cases, being evicted, which is the medieval euphemism for go die in another village. And work started early. Children of 5 or 6 already helped. They drew water, gathered firewood, scared away crows. They grew up knowing that rest was merely the pause between 2 sneezes of a cough. Women worked just as much as men. They took care of the house, the garden, the children, the clothes, the food, the animals. And they still sewed, and still made candles, and still prayed, because if the harvest went wrong, the fault was obviously theirs. Sundays were free, in quotes, because even without work in the fields, there was work for the soul. Mandatory mass, confession, fasting, fear of hell, and of course gossip smelling of stale bread. And when it wasn't farming, there were other equally charming occupations. Blacksmiths spent the day between fire and hammer. The smell of burnt iron stuck to the skin, and accidents were frequent. Crushed finger, burned eye, black lung. Cobblers stayed hunched over all day, sewing thick leather, hands deformed, backs in agony, and the final shoe didn't even serve to stop the mud. Bakers woke up in the middle of the night to ensure the bread came out hard on time. They sweated in the furnace, inhaled ash, and still got scolded if the bread didn't rise enough. There were also the tanners, responsible for treating animal skins. An elegant trade, spending the day among feces, urine, blood, and quicklime. The smell was so unbearable that these people were forced to live outside the villages as if they were walking bombs. And fishermen spent days at sea or on the river with torn nets, cold in their bones, and the risk of returning empty-handed. When they returned with something, the smell was the trophy that lasted days or weeks, depending on their luck with bathing, which, as we've seen, was 0. Even monks, spiritual figures, did not escape. They spent hours copying manuscripts by hand, illuminating letters with expensive ink and torturous posture, seeing the world through the slit of a monastery, and praying not to make a mistake, because scratching out the holy book could be considered heresy. And those who didn't work were seen as dead weight, beggars, invalids, the sick, all treated as a burden, as a sign of divine punishment or witchcraft or karma, even if that word didn't exist in the people's mouths. The elderly worked until they couldn't endure anymore, and when they couldn't, they became a problem. If someone offered rest, it was literal. A shallow grave, a hurried prayer, and a disguised relief. You might think, at least they had religious holidays. Yes, they had more than 100 throughout the year, but guess what? On many of them, it was forbidden to work, even if hunger was knocking. So the holiday became penance, a day without production, without food, but with mass and with guilt. Now imagine this cycle every single holy day. You didn't wake up thinking about dreams, ambitions, travel. You woke up thinking, will I manage to eat today? Will my tooth stop hurting? Will my ingrown toenail not get infected until I lose my foot? Medieval work was not noble. It was not poetic. It was torture on a daily rhythm. And if you survived until 40, you were already considered old, a walking miracle. So the next time someone complains that the office doesn't have air conditioning, remember that there were people who worked with their feet buried in mud, listening to thunder, and hoping the barley would thrive so they wouldn't be whipped. Yes, just that. You have a fever, your head throbs, your bones ache, and the only thing you can think is, I'm going to die. And you're not wrong. In the Middle Ages, this was called Tuesday. Getting sick was more than an inconvenience. It was a reminder that your body was fragile, medicine was superstition, and death always had its shoes on, because you never know when it might need to run. First stop, the local healer, a specialist in absolutely nothing but with many opinions. He looks at your tongue, shakes his head and says, "It's the humours." No, not humour like joy, but humour like bile and blood and other liquids you didn't even know you had. If they are unbalanced, spoiler, they always are. It's time for bloodletting. Yes, opening your vein and letting the blood flow with the hope that along with it go the fever, the malaise, and perhaps that persistent cough. Are you dizzy yet? Great. A sign that it's working or that you're going to faint, but it doesn't matter. If you don't get better, the next step is a mixture of induced vomiting with mysterious substances. Plants, charcoal, ground minerals, dried pigeon feces, everything depending on your social class, the phase of the moon, and the healer's patience. And if by a twist of fate you manage to drag yourself to a hospital, prepare yourself. The medieval hospital was a place where hope went to cough and stay. They were large, stuffy rooms, full of cramped beds, dirty cloths, and people already half dead. The priority was to welcome the soul, the body, only if there was time. Most of the attendants were monks or nuns, good at prayer, terrible with a scalpel. And still, they tried. He has a fever. Let's warm him up more. He's cold, let's cover him with straw. He's delirious, possessed, he can't feel his legs. Divine punishment. Medicine was a combination of trial and error, with an emphasis on error. The use of herbs, often effective, was discredited because it looked like witchcraft. And if you used a plant that worked too well, you had to explain why you didn't die. In extreme cases, you were sent to the barber surgeon. He cut, stitched, sawed everything in the same spot where minutes before he had shaved the baker's beard without washing anything, because soap was expensive, and the concept of infection only appeared after a few centuries and many mysterious deaths. And speaking of surgery, without anesthesia, without gloves, without asepsis, you bit a piece of wood, screamed or fainted. If you lived, you were considered strong. If you died, it was God's will. Of course, there were cases where people healed on their own because the human body is stubborn and some fevers pass. When this happened, the healer bragged. The barber boasted. The city said it was a miracle. You continued smelling bad and understanding nothing. People didn't know about microbes, but they knew certain diseases spread. The blame then was on the air, the wind, some curse. And this generated the most brilliant ideas like, let's isolate the sick with incense, or let's use leather clothes so the air doesn't enter the skin. The beaked masks, famous among plague doctors, were stuffed with flowers, vinegar and spices to disguise the smell of death and protect against bad air. Did it work? Of course not, but at least death came perfumed. And even in the face of all this, people prayed not for a cure, but to die quickly, because the suffering was so absurd, so persistent, that the only hope was for it all to end before the body began to rot while still alive. Today you complain about the taste of medicine. They swallowed clay with honey and called it treatment. You book an appointment via an app. They called the priest just as a precaution. You ask for a doctor's note to work from home. They asked forgiveness for sins before sleeping because they didn't know if they would wake up. And if by chance you survived all this, congratulations. It was probably luck. But the healer would say it was him, the barber that it was the saw, the midwife that it was the nettle tea, the priest that it was the prayer. You know, it wasn't any of that. It was the insistent, resistant body, and above all, desperate to stay alive in a world that did everything to kill you before 40. The Middle Ages was a time when everything, absolutely everything, could kill you. Hunger, of course. War, probably. Inevitable disease. But what about the small dangers? The invisible ones? Those that didn't come with a drum roll or a horse on fire? They were everywhere. Let's start with fire. Fire in the Middle Ages was the microwave, the house light, the stove, the heater, and the destroyer of villages. All at the same time. A stray spark and goodbye cabin. Houses were made of wood, covered in straw, with improvised chimneys that looked more like ventilation holes for the apocalypse. If a candle fell, there wasn't even time to scream, "Fire!" In minutes, half the village was unintentionally illuminated. People tried to put out the fire with buckets of water, wet cloths, or sometimes prayers. And of course, none of that worked. After fire, we have the structure. Medieval buildings were works of art in the most generous sense possible. Ill-fitting roofs, crooked walls, unsafe stairs. If you slipped, no one said, "Oh, what a pity." They said it was God. And it wasn't just at home. Markets, churches, bridges, everything was precarious. Falling was common, breaking an arm routine, dying of head trauma from slipping on a crushed tomato. Just another Monday. Now let's go to the animals. Not the wild ones, but the domestic ones. Horses that bit, oxen that kicked, pigs that devoured babies. This happened, and with frightening frequency. Cats, seen as walking witchcraft, were sometimes killed out of fear, but sometimes they simply attacked. And if you had an allergy, well, bad luck to you. No one knew what that was. Die sneezing. And the rats, always them, present in absolutely every place, in the bed straw, in the bread baskets, on the roofs in the middle of Mass. They carried fleas, lice, and the plague, of course. But that would only be discovered centuries later. At the time, they were just a constant nuisance and a source of nocturnal fright. You slept with one eye open, not for fear of a thief, but for fear of being bitten on the big toe by a famished rodent. And tools, as sharp as they were dangerous. Scythes, knives, axes, all used with little technique and much improvisation. Domestic accidents included severed fingers, deep cuts, and sometimes people impaled by tripping over a spear left in the hallway. Stairs, usually of raw wood, creaked and broke. Going up to the second floor was an act of faith and sometimes accidental suicide. Now let's go to what seems harmless. Food. Yes, it could also kill you, and not just by being spoiled, which was the rule, not the exception, but by being contaminated with hallucinogenic fungi like ergot on rye. Outbreaks of dancing plague were common. People going out into the streets, contorting, laughing, screaming, hallucinating. The village thought it was possession. The priest came, blessings, screams, crying, but in reality it was just bread with hallucinogens that you ate because it was the only thing you had. And the ceiling, the ceilings, when not consumed by termites or fire, simply collapsed because construction was done by eye. There were houses where it rained more inside than outside, and you slept hoping the beam wouldn't fall straight onto your chest. And if it fell, it was divine will. Even the act of drinking water could be a death roulette. You lowered the bucket into the well, pulled it up, and took a sip full of hope and coliforms. Maybe worms, maybe both. Maybe the spirit of someone who died in there 2 summers ago. And kitchen tools, simple but treacherous. A poorly made cut with the soup knife, and you had an infection that turned into fever, that turned into delirium, that turned into death. And what was people's reaction to danger? Most accepted it. There was no other way. To live was to survive. Dying was expected. No one was surprised. So-and-so fell off the roof. Ah, yes. Again? No, this time it was fatal. Ah, then no need to cover with straw. Yes, straw was used to cover the body to protect it, sometimes with flowers, sometimes just with cloth, but always with resignation. And of course, there were the wrong judgments. If a child got sick out of nowhere, it could be the fault of a spirit. If an adult died out of nowhere, witchcraft. If someone survived everything, they were suspicious, and so even living was dangerous. After all, drawing attention could put you in the sights of the bonfire, or envy, or authorities who were always looking for a scapegoat for when something went wrong. So you spent your life trying not to die, but without knowing where death would come from, because it could come from the bread, the stairs, the rain, the cat, the fever, the neighbor, the roof, the fire, or your own will to stay alive. You slept with fear, woke up with pain, and if you spent the whole day without bleeding, tripping, cutting, biting, or burning yourself, it was considered a good day. The next time you trip on a rug and complain, remember, there were people who fell from a rotten wooden bridge, were dragged by an angry pig, and were still blamed for not praying enough. And no one thought that was strange. You opened the door, if you could call that piece of wood with a keyhole a door, and went to face the street. But the medieval street wasn't just any street. It was a combination of mud, urine, screams, poop, and faith, because only with a lot of faith could you leave and return in one piece. First, the ground. Paving didn't exist outside the larger cities, and even in those, the loose stones were more treacherous than protective. Alleys turned into rivers of mud in winter, ovens of dust in summer. In the middle of the path, horse manure, open sewage, food scraps, and sometimes animal parts. And speaking of sewage, the medieval sanitary system was basically one: throw it out the window and pray no one is passing by. It is not an exaggeration. Houses had buckets or ceramic pots for physiological needs. Once full, which, let's face it, happened fast, the contents were dumped out the window. Some cities even had schedules for this. Attention, gentlemen, at 6 p.m., shower of feces. It wasn't said in those words, but the practice was exactly that. And if you were walking distracted, congratulations, you became part of the scenery. Furthermore, the streets were noisy, because everything happened there: sales, arguments, trials, public executions, drunken fights, religious preaching, mystical outbreaks, hysterical outbreaks, and real outbreaks. The market was the center of everything, an aromatic and sonic chaos. People shouting the price of rotten fish, children running between the stalls, loose animals, pigs, chickens, mangy dogs, all coexisting with frightening naturalness. Want to buy a turnip? Well, you'll have to negotiate with someone who hasn't bathed since the last harvest and pay with coins that have passed through 73 hands, 2 mouths, and maybe an intestine. Want to trade a piece of bread for some fabric? Prepare for a 2-hour debate, a light shove, and the real chance of ending the argument with one less tooth. Because fights exploded all the time, over food, over space, over honor. And since no one had therapy, and the only escape valve was a knife, everyone was an emotional barrel ready to explode. The police didn't exist as we know them. There were guards, but they were paid by the nobles, not the population. They were there to protect property and arrest inconvenient people. If you got beaten up in the middle of the street, the only chance of help was if a priest was passing by. And even then, he would probably just pray for you or use the moment as a metaphor in Sunday's sermon. And punishments were always public. Did you steal an onion? Jail, but first exposure. You were taken to the central square and tied to a trunk, sometimes in a structure known as a pillory. The people could throw fruit, stones, offensive words, or just watch with the indifference of someone who knows they could be next. Some hung by their hands, others by their ears. There were even those who stood with a sign reading "liar" around their neck, as if medieval Facebook were right there, live. And if you committed a more serious crime, or if the local lord was angry, the worst came: execution, beheading, hanging, burning, impalement, all with an audience. People bringing children, bringing snacks, commenting, "Look, they really outdid themselves today." And in the end, a collective sense of justice done, even if no one knew exactly what the guy had done. But the streets didn't live only on horror. There were also artists, acrobats, jugglers, musicians with out-of-tune flutes, poets reciting verses about the king's deeds or how wine was too expensive, all with one foot in improvisation and the other in mockery. It was the possible entertainment. You watched a man breathing fire while a rat crossed your foot, and you laughed, because laughing was rare and it was free. There were also processions, many of them. Religious, penitential, desperate. People walking barefoot, flagellating themselves, carrying crosses, all to ward off plague, hunger, drought, war, or just boredom. The street became a theatre of faith, a parade of sweaty, repentant bodies shouting out-of-tune litanies. Sometimes you just wanted to go to the well to get water, but halfway there you were pulled into a sermon, bumped by a horse, almost run over by a cart, and splashed by a bucket of someone else's urine. And yet everyone went to the street, because that was where life happened. Inside the house there was only cold, darkness, and silence. In the street there was chaos, but there were also people, bad, noisy, smelly people, but people. And at the end of the day, when the sun went down, people began to retreat, because walking at night was madness. The streets were poorly lit, dangerous, and full of legends. It was said that demons prowled, witches lurked, lost souls sought revenge. Most villages locked their gates at dusk. They literally closed the city. Whoever was outside, bad luck. Sleep where you can or don't sleep. And so life went on, day after day, sludge after sludge, smell after smell. The street was not a place of passage. It was the setting where everything happened and there was no escape. You might even hate leaving the house, but staying locked in the dark with rats on the roof and the fear of the plague didn't seem like a good idea either. So you put on your cape, if you had one, and faced the mud like everyone else, and dreamed of a world where the sidewalk was just a sidewalk, and not a minefield of excrement and despair. You arrived at the castle, the dwelling of the rich, the powerful, those full of pose and without soap. From the outside, the castle is even impressive, stone upon stone, high towers, flags waving, a symbol of strength. But inside, cold, damp, dark, and with a faint smell of mold mixed with dried meat, an aroma that no medieval incense could disguise. The rooms were huge, yes, but don't be fooled. The bigger the hall, the louder the echo of your cough, and the more space for the cold to circulate freely. The windows were tiny for defense, meaning ventilation only happened if the wind blew in the right direction. Lighting? Torches and chandeliers that smoked more than they illuminated. And the furniture scarce, hard, made to last and to hurt your lower back. High beds, full of straw, curtains, and aristocratic fleas. The mattress was more symbolic than functional. Sleeping there was like resting on a shelf covered with fabric. And the nobles, they had style. They wore heavy clothes of thick fabrics full of layers. Because the more cloth, the more status, and the more heat, the more sweat accumulated underneath. Monthly bath at most, and even then it was an event. They perfumed themselves with mixtures of flowers, spices, and animal fat. A perfume that for the time was irresistible. Today it would cause the evacuation of any closed room. Meals were a moment of ostentation, but also of strangeness. The table was long, cutlery non-existent or underutilized. Eating with your hand was common, shoving your face in the plate too. Napkin, your sleeve. Individual plates only for the special ones, and even then, shared with the flies. Food came in banquets. Whole roasted meats, hard breads, vegetables cooked until they looked like part of the decoration. Suspicious pies, and occasionally a swan decorated with feathers and all. It was beautiful to look at, horrible to eat. Spices were abundant, not for flavor, but to disguise the rot because fresh meat was rare. So the trick was, put enough cinnamon and no one notices the smell of decay. And wine. lots of wine, because water was unfit even in castles. Drinking wine was safer, even if diluted. Children, the elderly, monks, everyone drank and everyone slept, with their livers suffering in silence. Court entertainment was peculiar. There were jesters, troubadours, out-of-tune musicians, and jokes of questionable taste. The nobles laughed at everything or pretended to, because laughing at the wrong joke could cost your position or your head. There were also tournaments. Knights in heavy armor slapping each other with lances in the name of honor. The audience cheered, the knight fainted, and the horse, poor thing, did all the work. Noble women had their own gilded prison. They spent the day embroidering, playing out-of-tune instruments, reading psalms, and watching each other. The competition was silent but constant. A wrong hairstyle, eternal shame. A laugh too loud, suspicion of vulgarity. And marriage, of course, was an arrangement, always pure politics. The 12-year-old girl married the 50-year-old duke because the dowry included a mill. Romance only in the poems no one read. And hygiene, different from the common people. Yes, but not much. Castles had rudimentary toilets, holes in a stone carrying the contents outside the walls. Sometimes, when it didn't clog or come back with the wind, it was called a garderobe. And some believed the smell kept evil spirits away. In other words, if it really worked, the castle was a sanctuary. Parasites made no class distinction. Fleas, lice and bedbugs also liked embroidered sheets, and since bathing was a rare event, nobles used talcum powders, herbs and clean clothes to seem clean, just seem, and boredom. The boredom of the nobility was as lethal as any plague. They spent days doing nothing, walking through cold corridors, waiting for visits, knitting judgments, and every now and then ordering someone's execution just to shake up the afternoon. Nobles lived in a bubble, but it was a bubble of stone and obligation, where luxury was uncomfortable, food was decorative, and life was long enough to be slightly unbearable. The only certainty was the social calendar. Dinners with people you despised, prayers with people feigning piety, parties where no one danced, and meetings where everyone smiled out of fear. And when the day finally ended, the silence returned. Cold, muffled, heavy. You lay in that wooden bed, surrounded by tapestries and loneliness. You closed your eyes and thought, it's good to be rich, while the louse scratched your scalp and the sound of the freezing wind whistled between the ill-fitting stones of the wall. Good luck trying to sleep with that. Medieval religion was like air. It was everywhere. You needed it to live, but often it was toxic. From birth, your life technically belonged to the church. Literally, babies were baptized as quickly as possible, because if they died without baptism, and they died frequently, they went straight to limbo, a place between heaven and hell, without a view, without Wi-Fi, without an exit. Growing up, you learned to pray even before learning to speak properly, and the content of the prayer was always the same. Fear. Fear of the devil, fear of punishment, fear of temptation, and of course fear of the next disease God might send if you weren't at least reasonably pious. The church controlled absolutely everything: the land, education, culture, and principally guilt. Sunday was a holy day. Mass was mandatory. Not going was a sin. Arriving late, suspicious, sleeping on the bench, the devil might be acting. The homilies were long, chanted by priests with monotone voices in Latin, a language no one else spoke, but everyone pretended to understand. It was like watching a Zoom meeting freezing up, but with incense, confession, a true festival of personal humiliation. You entered the confessional and poured out your failures. Father, I thought about hitting my neighbor with a turnip, and the priest, with a solemn voice, responded, "Pray 10 Hail Marys and avoid vegetables as weapons." But the problem was that sins were like dust, inevitable and infinite. Everything could be a sin. Eating too much, eating too little, thinking, laughing, sleeping at the wrong time, looking the wrong way, feeling desire, breathing too hard, everything. And sins were not treated lightly. They were treated with promises of eternal damnation, fire, pain, screams, being eaten by worms forever. Yes, eternity was a concept heavily worked on in sermons and always in the context of hell, never vacation or rest. Salvation was expensive, literally. Selling indulgences, purchased pardons was common practice. You sinned, you paid, and that was it. Less time in purgatory. A great deal, provided you had coins. If you didn't, hope you had rich friends to pray for you after death. And speaking of death, medieval religion was obsessed with it. Bloody crucifixes, paintings of the Last Judgment, statues with expressions of eternal suffering. Everything was a reminder that your existence was merely a temporary and miserable stage before an eternal trial. Comforting, isn't it? The clergy said what was right, what was wrong, and, when in doubt, what you should fear. They decided if you could marry, with whom, when, and if they didn't like you, they could annul the marriage or excommunicate you, which was the medieval equivalent of being cancelled, only without social media and with slightly more infernal consequences. And don't think religious life was a sea of tranquility. Monks woke up at dawn to pray, worked in silence, ate in silence, died in silence. They copied manuscripts for hours by the light of smoky candles, with the posture of a statue and the real chance of getting a letter wrong and starting all over. It wasn't exactly the spiritual retreat Instagram sells today. Priests, on the other hand, were often political figures. They had land, influence, and knew how to use guilt as a tool of control. An angry priest could turn your life into hell before you even died, just insinuating you were a heretic or witch or suspected of sympathizing with the devil, and that was it. Goodbye. Peace. And yes, there were witches, or rather women with knowledge of herbs, midwives, healers, anyone who defied the general ignorance. Accusing them was easy, proving them guilty, but they still threw the woman in a river. If she sank, she was innocent. If she floated, a witch. And if she died, drowned. A regrettable mistake, of course, but at least now at peace. Religious processions were also intense. People walking kilometers, barefoot, flagellating themselves, crying aloud, with crosses on their backs and hearts weighing more than the backpack of an unprepared backpacker, all to show repentance. And because maybe, just maybe, God was watching that specific performance with favor. And relics, a spectacle apart. Fragments of Christ's cross, bones of saints, fingernails of the Virgin Mary. Every castle or church claimed to have one, often the same ones in different cities, because miracles have no rules apparently. People paid to see, touch, kiss. They cried, made requests. And when nothing happened, the fault was always the believers. Little faith, hidden sin, or the bad positioning of Venus. Although officially astrology was condemned, but only officially. Faith was a pillar, but a slippery pillar, wrapped in candles and metaphysical threats. You couldn't live without it, but you lived in fear of it. An emotional, spiritual dependency relationship of high risk. And even with all this, everyone kept believing, because it was either that or the void. And the void was even scarier. So you kept praying, even with hunger, even with cold, even with doubts, because not praying was more frightening than praying and not being heard. And when doubt struck, you buried it under a litany, and the cycle continued with more mass, more confession, more guilt, and the fear of hell as the soundtrack. After praying, fasting, fleeing from fire, plague, pig, and the shower of waste, what is left? Marriage or something like it. In the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't a question of love. It was a question of calculation, economy, territory, reputation. Feelings are for later or for never. If you were a woman, your destiny was defined before your first menstrual cycle. Your father was already negotiating the dowry while you played with straw dolls. Most marriages were decided by the men of the family, and the woman, of course, obeyed, because loving was a luxury, and luxury back then was a sin. The groom, a complete stranger, sometimes an elderly gentleman, other times a cousin you saw once at the harvest. It didn't matter. He had land, you had a womb. It was enough. The ceremony was simple. A priest, 2 witnesses, a flickering candle, a yes said with more resignation than joy. And that's it. Now officially your life is no longer yours. It belongs to your husband, the church, and the hope that you don't die in childbirth. The wedding night. Well, let's say romance was extremely rare. Sometimes there wasn't even any. The couple barely knew each other, and the concept of consent didn't even exist as a word yet. The relationship was seen as a duty. And if the wife refused, she was considered rebellious, a sinner. The man had the right and the duty to consummate. After all, the goal was simple: reproduction. Love, a dangerous distraction. Daily marital life was marked by routine and silence. The husband worked outside or warred or hunted or did absolutely nothing if he was noble. The woman took care of the house, the children, the animals, and the garden. And if she was lucky, she survived all that until the next harvest. Conversations were rare, demonstrations of affection almost non-existent. The most common touch was passing on the day's task or correcting an inappropriate attitude. Smiles were moderate and kisses usually reserved for images of saints. But there were exceptions. There were those who fell in love rarely, but it happened. And of course, these were the unhappiest couples, because true love without family authorization was considered a threat to order. A passion could generate fights, land disputes, wars. So the safest thing was to hide or forget. For those who dared to love, clandestinity remained. Letters exchanged in secret, furtive meetings in the stable, promises whispered between whispers and fear. It almost always ended badly, with forced marriage, punishment, or even confinement in a convent. Yes, the convent was the destination of many women who were no longer useful. Young widows, rebellious daughters, rejected wives, they were sent to pray for the rest of their lives. Some convents were strict, others softer, but all had the same goal: keep emotions under control. And divorce didn't exist. Marriage was eternal. What existed was annulment, but only if you were rich or if you convinced the bishop that the marriage was never valid. For example, if one of the two was sterile or if they were relatives. And spoiler, almost everyone was. Now, if you were a man, the scenario was only slightly less desperate. You still had to marry for convenience, support the family, deal with debts, and from time to time, go to war. But at least socially, you had permission to err, have lovers, be absent, or simply ignore your own wife. In fact, lovers were common, especially among nobles. There were legitimate wives for legitimate children, and there were lovers for pleasure and conversation. It was an informal arrangement, but accepted, as long as everything was discreet or almost. Adultery by women, however, was a scandal, sin, dishonor, and in some places, grounds for execution. Literally, stones, fire, or good old public shame. Even so, there were codes of courtship, especially between knights and ladies. The idea of courtly love, that platonic romance between a noble and a married woman, gained strength in poems. But only in poems. In real life, loving someone who wasn't your spouse was an artistic risk, and the children born out of necessity, raised to work or to marry another child from another equally unhappy family. Many died before age 5. Those who survived learned early their place in the world. If male, he inherited. If female, she was traded. Attachment was moderate, because loving a child was risky. He might not last, and mourning wasn't a luxury the peasant could afford. And if you didn't want to marry, difficult. Being single was suspicious, especially if you were a woman. The spinster was seen as a witch, a bad influence, or worse, useless. Single men had a little more space, but were still pressured. After all, who would take care of the land? Who would continue the family name? And in the middle of all this, Emotions were being compressed, hidden, ignored. You cried at night in silence, laughed in the morning out of obligation, and the heart kept beating slowly, without alarm, without love, without choice, just beating to remind you that you were still alive. Hunger was a constant in the Middle Ages, and when there was food, it didn't serve exactly to give pleasure. It served to keep you standing long enough to work, and working long enough to maybe eat again the next day. The basis of the diet: hard, cracked, fermented bread, sometimes sour, almost always, and not that artisanal sourdough bread from a fancy bakery. It was a bread that looked like a rock and had the same function as one: to make you heavy. Made with flour of everything: wheat, rye, barley, oats, or anything that could be crushed and mixed with water. The result? A dough that hardened faster than the will to live upon hearing the word tithe. And worse, good bread was for the rich. Peasants ate what was left: dark, coarse bread, often mixed with husks, ground straw, and even dust. That is when the baker wasn't accused of hiding sawdust in the dough to make it stretch. Spoiler: he did that, yes. The most common accompaniment: a thin soup made with whatever was available: leaves, roots, a stone for flavor and hope. It was called pottage, and the more water, the more generous it seemed, but also more tasteless and less nutritious. Meat only on special dates. And look at that, nobles had access to boars, rabbits, rams. They hunted for sport, but ate with greed. The meat was boiled, roasted, stewed, salted, and almost always poorly preserved. As for the poor, well, meat was a memory or an illusion, depending on the day. The most common thing was eating dried fish, salted until it looked like wood, or small pieces of cured meat hidden inside the soup. Sometimes not even that, just the smell left on purpose to trick hunger. And eggs were rare because chickens served for more than laying eggs. They were currency, they were a gift, they were a lunch. So if she didn't lay, she became a dish. Milk only if you had a cow, and even then it spoiled fast. Yogurt didn't exist. Cheese, only the hardest, the oldest, the most sour. Fruits were seasonal. You ate what was in season. If you ate out of season, it was seen as boldness or sorcery, and you probably got sick. Legumes few, greens rare, salad, unknown concept. The closest thing was a mixture of overcooked leaves, losing color and taste, served with weak vinegar and salt when it wasn't in short supply. And salt, by the way, was a luxury. It cost money. It was currency. Whoever had salt had power. That's why salting meat was a sign of wealth, and excess salt was common to disguise the taste of meat that was already passing its prime, or meat that had already passed and they didn't warn you. Sugar practically non-existent. There was honey, and even that was reserved or stolen from bees in risky escapades. Sweets were legend, dessert, fiction. Sweetness was an accident, not a category. And to drink, wine, always wine, weak, diluted, lukewarm. Water was too dangerous. Beer also appeared, thicker, more bitter, less filtered. Children drank, old people too. Drunkenness was the least of problems. The liver complained, but the heart gave thanks. And of course, food poisoning. Without refrigeration, without hygiene, without knowing what bacteria was, food often killed slowly or all at once. Eating something spoiled was common. Knowing it was spoiled only came after the cramps arrived. But most importantly, eating was a collective act. Families gathered, sat on the floor, shared everything in a single pot, ate with their hands, without cutlery, without plates, without ceremony. And it was the most awaited moment of the day, even if the food was terrible, because it was there, between one spoon of soup and another, that one spoke of the day, told a story, hoped that life would be just a little less hard. In the castles, the banquet was exaggerated. Rows of dishes, decorated meats, exotic fruits brought from afar. But everything served cold, because the kitchen was far, the path was slow, and reheating wasn't an option. The nobles ate too much, The serfs too little, but in the end everyone left heavy, some by the stomach, others by the lack thereof. And when the food ran out, fear came because no one knew if there would be more the next day. The harvest could fail, the rain might not come, the grain could spoil, and then the real hunger began, the kind that dries the skin, sinks the eye, steals even the strength to walk. During these times, the diet became prayer and fasting, a divine and stomach imposition. So if today you look at your plate and complain about the taste of broccoli, remember that in the Middle Ages, broccoli was a distant dream and dinner, a test of endurance. The sun hasn't even shown its face, and you already feel the cold ground on your feet. There is no alarm clock. What wakes you is the rooster's scream, the stomach's rumble, or the neighbor's persistent cough, who, by the way, should already be in the field. Working was living, and living was carrying things, planting things, digging holes, sometimes without knowing why, sometimes by order of someone who never stepped in the mud. If you were a peasant, your routine was the same every day. Monday, Tuesday, Saturday, Easter, Christmas. It didn't matter. Arms were always occupied, backs always curved, and faces almost always covered in dirt, sweat, and a slight regret for having been born. You went out with tools that looked more like extensions of your misery. A crooked hoe, an improvised shovel, a plow pulled by an ox that looked more tired than you, and off you went dragging hope through the plantation. The soil hard, seeds few, water not always there, climate fickle. And even so, it was your obligation to produce, because the feudal lord collected taxes and didn't accept drought as an excuse, nor plague, nor pestilence, nor mourning. You planted wheat, barley, oats, whatever grew, a part stayed with you. A larger part went to the noble, and another part was just to pay the church. God apparently also needed to eat. Tools were rudimentary, technique ancestral. Knowledge was passed orally by an old man with a zigzag spine and the certainty that last year was worse. Shifts started before light and ended when the body gave up. There was no formal break, just that brief hour when you sat on a stone, bit a piece of moldy bread, and contemplated the horizon, which has always promised nothing. And don't think work was only in the fields. Women also worked in the garden, in the kitchen, caring for children, animals, clothes, the sick husband, often everything at the same time. Rest came only when she fell asleep, exhausted, in the same corner where she would wake up shortly after. Children learned early. At 5 years old, they already helped. At 7, they already had fixed tasks. At 12, they were already ready to be traded in marriage or sent as apprentices, which was basically a polite form of slavery. And urban work in the cities, the scenario was different, but only in smell. Less field, more smoke, less earth, more excrement. There were blacksmiths, cobblers, carpenters, weavers, each with their trade, each with their workshop, small, dark, stuffy. The noise was constant, hammers, saws, screams, and the risk of losing a finger was part of the contract. Even without a contract, apprentices worked for years without pay. In exchange, they gained knowledge, elbows, orders, and maybe in the future a chance to open their own workshop if they survived, if they didn't go blind from the smoke or deaf from the master's screams. Fairs also generated temporary, precarious, heavy jobs, setting up stalls, unloading carts, caring for animals, all for a few coins and the privilege of going to sleep with a back even more crooked than in the morning. And the worst was when a community project came along, the construction of a new bridge or wall or church. Everyone was summoned because it is for everyone's safety, which meant carry stone for 3 days straight, without enough food, without clean water, and under the supervision of a priest who said effort sanctified. No one dared complain because complaining was a sin, and sin, as we've seen, meant jail or bonfire. And for those who thought monks lived better, well, it depends on the point of view. They also worked, and a lot. They ploughed the monastery fields, copied manuscripts, cooked, cleaned, made beer. Yes, the drink of saints, but with a load of obligations so rigid that many died of fatigue and guilt. The only group that really worked less were the nobles, who even so claimed to be always busy with decisions, strategies, dinners, hunts, balls, eternal discussions about taxes they themselves never paid. Free time was a privilege, but almost no one knew what to do with it, because resting back then seemed like waste, seemed like luxury, and luxury, like everything, came with guilt. And when the body finally couldn't take it anymore, you kept working, dragging your leg, hand trembling, eye tearing, because stopping was admitting weakness, and weakness was punishment or shame or often death itself. And so the cycle followed. Work, eat little, pray much, sleep poorly, wake up again, and start all over. The head hurt. The body didn't want to get up. The chest tightened without reason. You didn't have a fever, nor a cough, nor an apparent wound. Just tiredness, that desire not to exist. But in the Middle Ages, this wasn't recognized as sadness. It was laziness, or worse, possession. Mental health was a concept no one knew, and therefore no one cared for. If you cried too much, they said it was weakness. If you went silent, they suspected a secret. If you talked to yourself, they prayed for you. If you slept too much, they woke you by force. If you didn't sleep, they sent a priest. Depression was called melancholy, an imbalance of humors, those mystical liquids that explained everything. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. If you were sad, it was excess black bile. Solution? Bloodletting, or maybe a walk or a light exorcism to be sure. Anxiety didn't have a name, it was just agitation of the soul, treated with long prayers, forced fasts, and a nice dose of isolation. After all, if you were restless, it's because you had something to hide or something to pay for. And whoever heard voices didn't have much choice, either a saint or a witch or sick of spirit. Judgment depended on the content of the voices. If they were celestial, glory. If they were strange, bonfire. Outbreaks were treated with fear, literally. The sick person was locked up, chained, exposed to collective prayer, purified with cold water, covered with relics, and left alone in silence to reflect on their sins. Of course, many didn't return, dying of cold, hunger, or despair. And women suffered even more. A woman who cried in excess could be called hysterical, but not hysteria as a diagnosis. Hysteria as a synonym for female lack of control. Solution: marriage, pregnancy, or seclusion. Women considered difficult were sent to convents, where they had to pray until they forgot who they were, or until no one remembered them anymore. Men, when they showed suffering, were seen as weak or cursed. It was more acceptable for a man to die of plague than to admit he was afraid of the dark, or missed someone, or just felt sadness. And guilt? Ah, that was abundant. Everything was your fault. The drought, the disease, the miscarriage, the poorly done birth, the lightning that struck the plantation, the wine that turned sour. If you felt something strange inside, it was because you had done something wrong, or forgotten to pray, or looked too long at someone from outside the village. The mind was a minefield, but no one knew where the explosives were. They only knew that every now and then someone exploded, cried, ran naked, stopped talking, disappeared, and the others prayed, avoided, and moved on as if nothing had happened, because it was safer to pretend not to see. Religious figures sometimes wrote about weary soul or demonic temptation, but always under the gaze of faith, never as a natural process, never as a sign of the body asking for help. And collective outbreaks also happened. People who started dancing non-stop, without music, without reason, for days, until they fell, until they died. They called it St. Vitus's dance. Others laughed until they lost their breath. Others screamed for weeks. All this in groups, in entire cities. The explanation: spirits, divine punishment, collective sin, never hunger, never trauma, never oppression. And hallucinations. Ah, bread with moldy rye worked miracles. The fungus caused visions, tremors, burning, but no one thought of that. It was witchcraft, it was possession, it was a sign that the apocalypse was coming. The only therapy was confession. Talk to the priest, count your sins, hope for absolution, and leave relieved or more guilty. It depended on the priest. There was no rest for the mind because it wasn't considered a separate part of the body, or if it was under the dominion of faith, never medicine. Gradually, people learned to silence what they felt, to ignore what hurt, to swallow tears, to smile only in front of others, to pray as if the soul were clean, even when it was in tatters. And so the suffering continued, disguised, coated in holiness, painted in silence, and people went on living without knowing why, without knowing for whom, just because they were born. And now it was too late to go back. Rest, for the mind didn't exist, but the weight, that was constant. And all this in the name of normality. You finished working, your hands are calloused, your body aching, your brain half shut down, and you think, maybe today I'll distract myself. Except we are in the Middle Ages, and distraction is a relative concept. The first leisure option, go to church. Yes, because a good part of what was called a social event involved mass, procession, sermon, or some biblical enactment with a coughing actor, a torn costume, and a real sheep in the middle of the central nave. The church was the cinema, the theatre, and the central square. The problem was the plot, always the same: guilt, punishment, and miracle. The soundtrack, Gregorian chants that seemed eternal and sometimes really were. But let's say you wanted something lighter. There were the fairs, lively events full of noise, dust, and too many people. You could buy an onion, see a rearing goat, and hear a troubadour reciting about a war no one remembered. All this while, someone stole the only bread you had. Fairs also had performances, jugglers, musicians, acrobats, men eating fire, or something that looked like fire, women singing out of tune. Was it entertainment? Yes. Was it safe? Never. Several of these artists used sharp objects, skittish animals, or simply screams. And if you were a child, your fun was running among chickens, climbing on barrels, making toys with bones or stones, sometimes playing fake death with the friend who fainted fastest. And that was the most popular game of the summer. For the bolder adults, there were the taverns. Dark, stuffy places smelling of old beer, sweat, and frustrated expectation. You entered, sat on a crooked bench, ordered a drink, and hoped no one picked a fight with you. Because yes, fights happened frequently, almost as part of the decor. Games, dice, rudimentary cards, bets on anything that moved. Rats, chickens, flies. Whoever lost paid with coin, or with their hat, or with their teeth. Music played on lutes, fiddles, bone flutes. Repetitive, sad, with lyrics speaking of war, harvest, or impossible loves between people who never looked each other in the eye. Dancing too, but in moderation. Dancing too much was suspicious. It could be possession or uncontrolled excitement. Some regions even banned certain rhythms because hips couldn't seem happy. And love, well, we already talked about that, but flirting at parties was watched closely. A prolonged look already generated gossip. A touch of the hand could end in forced marriage, or a duel, or both things in the same week. There were also religious festivals, special foods, candles, songs, moments of gathering that began with prayer, continued with fasting, and ended with guilt. And for those who wanted adrenaline, they could watch public punishments. Yes, that was considered entertainment. People stuck in the pillory being cursed, stoned, spat on, or being whipped in the square, sometimes hanged. Everyone watched. Some even brought food as if it were a picnic. Children saw, old people commented, and parents said, "Look what happens to those who disobey." It was educational according to them. And there were stories told at night around the bonfire with someone older, with a raspy voice, telling legends of dragons, saints, and battles that no one knew if they were true, but everyone pretended to believe. Stories of monsters, apparitions, witches appearing at crossroads, talking wolves, men turning to stone. You listened, trembled, and then went to sleep or tried to, because yes, the medieval night was dark. Not just due to the absence of light, but due to what imagination did with the dark. Every noise was a beast, every shadow a threat. And since there were no locks on the doors, you slept hoping no one would enter, neither people nor worse things. Dreams confused, interrupted by cold, by rats, by hunger, by nightmares about the morning sermon. And the next day, everything started again. Leisure was brief, limited, and almost always came with a hangover, debt, or guilt, sometimes with all three together. You had fun as you could, or pretended to have fun, because the real medieval fun was surviving another day, and that for them was already a victory. You wake up with a slight headache, throat scratching, a strange heat in your face. In 2025 you would think, it's just a cold. In the Middle Ages, options ranged from bubonic plague to divine punishment, and none of them involved comfortable rest and vitamin C. Health was a game of chance, and honestly, almost no one won. You could be great one day and the next be carried out of the village in a cart covered with straw, coughing, burning with fever, hands swollen and black spots on the body. If you were very lucky, maybe you wouldn't even feel pain because you'd faint before, but most of the time you felt everything. Diseases came from all sides, from the water, the air, the rat, the food, the neighbor, the priest, the cow, the sheet, especially the sheet, that piece of poorly washed fabric you only saw twice a year and was shared with 3 generations of the same family. The most feared, the plague, of course, but it wasn't alone. There was dysentery, leprosy, smallpox, typhoid fever, mysterious fevers no one knew where they came from, but always left someone pale, trembling, and dead. And of course, the sickness of the chest, which today we would call tuberculosis, but back then was just another slow way to die coughing blood. Diagnosis based on skin color, breath smell, and quantity of urine. If the pee was clear, good sign. If dark, bad news. If blue, it was a miracle, or a side effect of cistern water. The treatment? Well, depends on your social class. If poor, the remedy was to pray. Or drink tea of some leaf pulled from the backyard, boiled until it became slime and mixed with honey. If there was honey, of course. If rich, you hired a doctor who basically did the same things as the village healer, only with more Latin words. Standard treatment included bloodletting, cutting you to release bad fluids, poultices, rotten herbs crushed and applied with old cloth, purgatives, mixtures that made you sick from every orifice, and in worst cases, amputation. Yes, cutting off limbs was a medical practice. If you hurt your leg, the doctor said, let's prevent it from getting infected. How? Cutting it off. There was no anesthesia, just drink and faith, lots of faith. And if the wound smelled bad, they put bugs, maggots, because somehow they ate the dead tissue and left the living. Sometimes it worked. Other times the patient died before the maggot arrived. Hygiene was viewed with suspicion. Too much bathing was bad. Opened the pores, left the soul vulnerable. So the ideal was to sweat in peace without contact with soap. Dirt was the protective layer of the time, literally. Hospitals existed, but not like today. They were places where you went to die with dignity or without. Wooden beds, hay on the floor, flies on the ceiling, moans in the air. One or another monk took care. Some washed wounds with vinegar, others just prayed beside the bed. And how to warn the population someone was sick? Simple. Ringing bells, putting a cross on the door, or in the case of contagious diseases, tying up the sick person. Sometimes they agreed, sometimes just with the force of indifference. Epidemics were seen as divine tests, God testing, God punishing, God reminding that life was short. So, when the city started coughing in unison, everyone fasted, knelt, self-flagellated, and blamed themselves. Of course, there were also those who blamed witches or Jews or neighbors. There was always someone convenient to blame when the air smelled bad. And alternative medicine? That was a festival of creativity. Amulets, potions made with urine and wine, dried beetles in powder, animal parts, ground stones, snake oil. Nothing that cured, but everything that occupied time. Children got sick first, old people too. Pregnant women, of course, and in the end, the disease didn't choose. It came like wind, entered through cracks, spread through bread, through cough, through forgotten towel. When you realized, it was too late. Bells rang again, the cart passed, and the village prayed in silence. And whoever survived was afraid, because they knew it wasn't merit, it was chance, it was pure biological roulette. And at any moment, it could all start again. That's why every sneeze was evaluated with attention, every sweat investigated, every sigh feared. In the Middle Ages, living was an uncertain wait between the next harvest and the next epidemic, and you could only hope not to be the first to cough. You survived miraculously. You still have a weakness in your legs. Vision somewhat blurry, but in Middle Ages logic, this isn't illness, this is a sequel, and sequels no one treats. You return home if you can call that home. The same damp corner, with the same smell of wet hay, and now with the addition of guilt for still being alive. Because the neighbor didn't have the same luck, the woman on the corner neither, and the baker's son, better not to even speak. People look at you as if you were marked, because deep down everyone is afraid that you are still half sick, or that you bring bad energies, or that death forgot to take you and is just waiting for you to nap again. Medieval recovery was not monitored, nor cared for. You returned to work gradually or too fast, without guidance, without ointment, without physiotherapy, without take it easy. Normal muscle pain, dizziness, offer of the day, racing heart, a sign you have faith. Rest was limited to the time your boss accepted seeing you stopped. If it was a stricter feudal lord, 2 days. If slightly more human, maybe 3. But after that, it was hoe in hand and faith on the ground. And you dragged yourself literally with a half-numb leg, back pain that didn't exist before, a tiredness that doesn't pass even after 12 hours of sleep, which, by the way, you never get. Common sequels, loss of vision, difficulty walking, chronic pains no one knew how to name, and of course behavior changes, because trauma also exists, even without a name. Some returned quieter, others more aggressive. There were those who developed a mania for cleaning, or fear of leaving the house, or fear of the dark or of people. But since no one understood any of this, what was said was simple. So-and-so came back strange, and that's it. It was that. You got a label and lost freedom. Some were removed from the community, others just avoided, and the unluckiest sent to institutions. That is, if there were any nearby. And if you were a man, strange women post-illness were seen as potential witches. After all, whoever survives and comes back different probably made a pact, heard hell up close, or learned things they shouldn't. Some ended up stoned, others disappeared mysteriously. Some ended up in convents, that magical solution society used for everything that bothered them. And the family? There wasn't always support, largely because everyone there was also dealing with something. Loss, hunger, fear of relapse. So even those who loved you wanted you functional and fast. What remained was silence, that feeling that something inside broke, but no one wants to know, no one wants to hear. You only hear the sounds of routine returning, the cart passing, the bell ringing, the blacksmith's scream, the child crying, everything the same as before. But inside, you are slower and no one notices. Faith is still your only resource. You pray to get better, pray to forget, pray to return to being who you were. But every day it becomes clearer that this won't happen. The body improves, slowly, the cough passes, tremors diminish, but something remains. A weight, a mist in the head, a nameless discomfort, a void that only grows. You don't talk about it because no one talks. Because back then silent pain was a virtue. Suffering in silence was a sign of humility. Complaining was a sin. And you already sinned too much just by having returned. Routine tries to swallow you and succeeds in parts. You return to the field, to the fair, to the bell, to the church bench, but with a detachment only you feel. Everything is the same, but everything is strange. And days pass like this, one at a time, without hurry, without taste, without color. Life goes on, but you don't know where to. And then, on any late afternoon, while looking at the grey sky and listening to the mass bell echoing again, you think, maybe this is it. Surviving isn't returning to living, it's just continuing to walk with fewer parts, with more silence, and with the hope that at the very least tomorrow won't get worse. Time passes, or at least that's what they say, because in practice, days are so similar. They seem the same. The sky changes, but the ground doesn't. The wind blows, but never takes the dust away. And in the middle of this tired cycle, there is something that persists. Fear. Fear that the disease returns. Fear that the harvest fails. Fear of the feudal lord changing his mind. Fear of the church noticing you too much. Fear of cold, of fire, of the dark. Fear of neighbors. Fear of yourself. You don't speak of these fears. Why isn't it spoken? Because fear here is part of the decor. It's in the cracked walls, in the taste of soup, in the tone of adults' voices. But it molds everything. You walk slowly, not because you are tired, but because you want to avoid glances. You answer always with "yes, sir," even when there is no reason. You pray before sleeping, not out of faith, but for protection. Not against the devil, but against the living. Because what really scares in the Middle Ages are people. A wrong word, and you become a suspect, a strange behavior, and it becomes conversation, a weird object inside the house, and you become a case. Social hysteria was a collective sport. If someone started suspecting you, others followed. And when the tide turned, no one defended because fear multiplied by silence. And rumors, so those walked faster than the plague and more accurately. A woman who knew how to read. Witch. A man who spent too much time alone. Heretic. A young man who refused marriage. Sodomite. A child who talked in their sleep. Daughter of the demon. Medieval gossip was a sentence. You worried about everything, including what you couldn't see. Spirits, lost souls, shadows walking alone. Hell wasn't a metaphor. It was an address. And according to sermons, it was where most ended up. And there were still signs. If the cow stopped giving milk, it was a curse. If the tree dried up, it was a spell. If the baby cried too much, it was the evil eye. And the priest confirmed, always confirmed. So every gesture was calculated, every word filtered, every sigh disguised as tiredness. Medieval anxiety didn't have a name, but it had a shape. It was the act of looking over your shoulder before sleeping. It was leaving the candle lit. It was hiding the notebook with strange drawings. It was locking the door, even knowing the lock was symbolic. And in the fields, fears had names. Wolf, thief, war. Wolves came at night, silent, hungry, and disappeared before the sun. Sometimes they took chickens, other times they took children. Thieves appeared in groups, took everything, even what wasn't worth anything, because the pleasure was destroying, not just stealing. And war was the greatest of fears. It wasn't news, it was a surprise. One day, soldiers passed, invaded, looted, forced, and when they left, they took along the little you had. Sometimes someone from your house, sometimes your own peace. You lived praying that no one remembered your village existed. Invisibility was protection, anonymity, a shield. Being important, never, because the important ones were the first to fall or the first to serve as examples. And yet there was a greater fear, that of eternal damnation, because everything was sin. Laughing too much, eating too much, thinking wrong, dreaming of the forbidden, wanting something beyond the permitted. Hell was certain, only the reason varied. And the only way out was confession, talking to the priest, delivering your soul in words, hoping he believed, and if he didn't believe, well, hell was already a pre-scheduled reality. So you get used to the weight in your chest, with care in your steps, with the constant cold on the back of your neck, with absolute silence on nights when something creaks and you pretend you didn't hear. Fear is learned, and then one forgets it is fear. It becomes instinct, becomes routine, becomes part of what you call life. And when someone asks if everything is fine, you answer yes, because you are alive. And this here is already a miracle. The body tired. First the legs, then the arms. One day you realize you don't feel anger anymore, nor hunger nor haste, only that torpor, that desire to lie down and let time pass, even if it doesn't wait for you anymore. You lived like everyone else, with fear, with pain, with stifled laughter and with a choked sigh. You survived more than many, less than few, and now no one notices, no one asks. Your name doesn't go into a book, your face doesn't go into stained glass. Your legacy? A pair of worn tools and a soup no one makes quite the same anymore. Old age, if that name fits, arrives slowly, like the shadow of a candle going out. You feel the days longer, not because they have more hours, but because you have fewer reasons. Pains increase and there is no relief, only acceptance. You watch everything from the same wooden bench where you sat young, only now it creaks more. Or maybe it's you. The village children don't know your full name. They call you Grandpa, Old Aunt, Mr. So-and-so, and you answer because that's what remains, answering even without being called. Stories of youth no one hears anymore. They are too busy trying to die as you did, as everyone did. Sometimes you look at the sky and try to remember someone, a place, a phrase you used to say, but memory has turned into a foggy field, like the winter mornings that swallow the village and only leave the sound of bells and crows. What remains are small rituals. Sunday soup, prayer before sleep, patched blanket, and that moment of silence where you listen to your own thoughts and realize they diminished. You don't think as much, just feel a warm mixture of longing, sleep, relief. The end isn't announced. There is no trumpet, nor warning, nor visit, just a day when you don't get up. And for the first time, no one blames you for it. Someone enters, finds you, covers you. The village continues, the bell rings. The step disappears slowly, like a small flame, like a whisper in the field, like a name crossed out of the priest's notebook. But while the body rests, the story stays. And now, lying in silence, listening to this voice that is also fading, you can rest, because what was lived, and what wasn't will never be missed. Good night. Sleep in peace, and please dream of anything except the Middle Ages.